Hello, everyone. So, we're going to talk about Elio in this video and how it treats disability in order to give you some ideas about what to write about if you are choosing to write about Elio for the paper. So, Elio was released in 2025 as Pixar's 29th animated feature. It was directed by a lot of people, three. We have Madeline Sharafian, Domi Shi of Turning Red fame, and Adrian Molina, who actually left the project while it was being made, but still gets a director credit. But apparently there was some drama behind the scenes because Elio was originally going to be not traditionally masculine, and he was supposed to be queer coded, and this is because Adrian Molina, who came up with this whole project, he envisioned Elio this way initially because he himself is gay and had a rough time growing up because, of course, he was different and he had non-traditional interests, specifically interests that are not traditionally masculine. So, they got rid of all of that, though, because apparently parents at test screenings didn't care for it, and, Disney, they gotta think about that money, apparently. And they didn't go with that direction. So, that is quite unfortunate for queer people out there who would like more representation. But, there is some other representation, kind of, in this movie, and that is with the neurodivergence angle that seems to be there, even though it isn't explicitly identified as such. So that's mostly what we're going to be exploring in this PowerPoint. Before we dive into it, though, I wanted to give some context on Disney and disability. So, whenever I do this assignment, I have usually a Disney movie and usually a horror movie. And both those kinds of movies have long histories of depicting disability. As far as Disney goes, they have had lots of disabled characters in the past. In class, we actually talked about Nemo and Dumbo, for example. And then they have people like Lilo, who, like Elio, some people think is meant to represent a neurodivergent child. Lilo, for example, has these rituals where she feeds a sandwich to Pudge the fish, in order to prevent bad weather, and she does this on a strict schedule. And she also has trouble interacting with her peers, and is prone to outbursts because of her frustration, etc. And a lot of people think she might be neurodivergent. The same goes for Elio, which we'll get to in a second. I did want to hit upon the fact that Disney and Pixar, even though they by and large have positive depictions of disabled characters, they do have some not so great depictions. Something that comes to mind with Pixar is Lotso. I did Toy Story 4 in the past for this assignment, and I discovered that Lotso might be an example of narrative prosthesis. Of course, he is the bad guy. He has a cane. That, in Toy Story 3, he's the bad guy, if you don't know that movie. But he has a cane, which might signify that he is evil. It's literally a symbol for him being bad. Another character who has a cane is this random person I have who you probably have no idea who she is. But she is Dahlia from Wish, if you ever saw that. And she has a cane, but it's for no reason, apparently, other than her just having a cane because the movie needed a disabled person in there for max representation. So she's sort of like a token disabled character. There's not much to her character, if anything. I couldn't tell you the first thing about Dahlia from Wish. So Disney does sometimes descend into tokenism. They sometimes descend into narrative prosthesis with characters, like Captain Hook, who is evil and he has a hook hand, etc. And we also have people like Dumbo, who we talked about in class. Even though he seems positive, he very much fits the social model, because even though he trips over his big ears, he's still able to fly with those ears, even though people doubted him. So he wasn't necessarily disabled at all, per se. But at the same time, he is what we might call inspiration porn. I think that's a term. Inspiration porn is what they call it when there's a character who is disabled in a narrative beating the odds because they're so cool and awesome or what have you. But the idea is such a depiction is hollow because, disabled people don't want to be, generally speaking, they don't want to be featured in media as stunning and brave. They just want to be depicted as normal. So, as just a normal person like anybody else. So there could be some negative implications with someone like Dumbo. And to get back to Elio, we can talk about how they treat his apparent neurodivergence. And I think there are several symbols in the movie that are related to this. For example, the golden record, which apparently NASA actually is sending these things out, with information about our planet and our species on there. But anyway, so they're a real thing. But anyway, they, in the movie, I think it represents Elio wanting to find community because he struggles so much to do so on Earth because of his differences. And then we have the Communiverse badge, which represents belonging. So Elio initially believes that he will never fit in on Earth because of how different he is, so he thinks his place is among the stars. In the end, he realizes that he does have a strong community on Earth after all, and that the Communiverse might not be as inclusive as it seems to be, considering it excludes Grigon, for example. But the badge represents his perception of what it means to belong. And then we have Glorden's disc, which sort of reminded me of something like an inhaler for people who have asthma, or something like an EpiPen for someone who has allergies. This is a device he depends upon because Glorden has a disability, right? He has a proneness to hypothermia, and he needs that disc to survive. So, yeah, I think that very much is related to the film's depiction of disability. And then we have the ham radio, which I think also is a symbol of community, because it links people together, especially at the end there, when they're all talking to Elio and Olga, all the people on Earth, including people that Olga shunned, like Melmac, and people that bullied Elio, like Bryce. all these people reconciling and coming together to help Olga and Elio navigate back to the communiverse to save Glorden. I think the radio really represents community and how important it is for disabled people to have a strong community to be able to thrive. Now I wanted to talk a bit more about Elio himself. So, as we alluded to before, he is autistic? Probably, maybe. Or at least he appears to be, even though it is never confirmed in the movie itself. At the very beginning of the movie, he is non-verbal, and he is hiding under the table, and we see him messing with the tongue of his shoe, as if he is stimming. Probably the most obvious parallel to someone with autism is his special interest. In this case, it would be space and aliens, which he is obsessed with. Like many people with autism, he also struggles with social interactions. For example, the beach scene with Caleb and Bryce is probably the most glaring example of this. The way he acts, he doesn't seem to understand how his actions might affect Bryce and Caleb's feelings, and he ends up getting injured after that interaction because he gets overwhelmed by all of the stimuli, and that results in him getting the eye patch, which I want to talk about later. But actually, let's talk a little bit about it now. He does have that eye patch, which is a bit strange because people online, before the movie came out, they speculated that it had something to do with a physical disability, like amblyopia, or lazy eye, as it's commonly called. But apparently not. Apparently it is just to do with an injury, even if that injury is related to how Elio is different from others. It's still an injury as opposed to a disability. But put a pin in that. I want to talk more about that eye patch later. By which I mean right now. Alright, so speaking of that eye patch, like I said, it is the result of an eye injury. The ham radio hits Elio in the face during his confrontation with Caleb. And we talked about that radio as a symbol of community, but it could also represent, in that moment at least, a symbol of a failure to find a community. So, but of course, the ham radio is redeemed when it is used to save Glorden, when all of the people come together to help with that. But anyway, to get back to the eye patch, he has to wear it for 2 weeks after that confrontation with Caleb. So, if that is the case, it is not representative of a disability, but just an injury, and that injury very much is a physical representation of how Elio is different from those around him. And I think the eye patch could be as simple as that. Elio even refers to it as a battle scar, his eye injury at one point. And of course he would have these battles because he has trouble relating to others. That said, he doesn't have much trouble relating to Glorden because they are very similar. And I think the eye patch, and they're similar because of their parent situation, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I think that eye patch might represent how he is able to find community, Elio that is, with someone like Glorden, who is a kid who has a guardian who doesn't get him, and Glorden just happens to not, and Glorden is different because he doesn't want to get into his carapace like the other Hylergians. And Glorden doesn't have eyes, so I think it might be symbolic, that eye patch of Elio's bond with Glorden. That said, while we're on the eye patch, I have this picture of this kid wearing an eye patch, and it's actually an Elio eye patch, and he's dressed like Elio with the colander on his head. So parents apparently were happy about the eye patch because it made their kids who wear eye patches because of a medical condition feel like they are seen and represented and what have you. But are they really? Because Elio, like we said, does not have a physical disability. The eye patch is just something he wears while he's injured. And that might come with some negative implications, especially considering the eye patch's role with exposing the clone Elio. So, the clone Elio only has one eye, and what might that say? Might that say, perhaps, that people who wear eye patches are weird and might only have one eye, which some people might think is weird? Does it say that they are fake because the clone is a fake? Might it say that they are deceptive because the clone is deceptive? Maybe, if you read too much into it, honestly. But that if we are examining disability representation in this movie, it's probably necessary to read a little far into it. Yeah, that eye patch, it is a bit strange because it doesn't give a great look to people with eye patches, maybe. But at the end of the day, it probably is just a symbol for Elio's struggle to fit in and relate to others, etc. Let's talk about Grygon. So Grygon is Glorden's father, and he has a lot in common with Elio, if you think about it, because as Elio was rejected by Bryce and Caleb, Grygon is rejected by the Communiverse. And Elio does use that to try to negotiate with Grygon, which works to an extent, and I did want to note that Grygon, I think, represents someone who uses these, I don't want to say prosthetics, but for lack of a better word, these prosthetics or these, well, it wouldn't be a prosthetic because it's not replacing anything on his body, but it would be a suit, right? Accessories, there's the word. He uses accessories to sort of compensate for a body he isn't comfortable with. I found it was interesting that he has 4 eyes with his helmet, even though in reality he doesn't have, in his natural body, he doesn't have any eyes at all. It definitely seems like he's compensating, like he has low self-esteem, thinks of himself as weak, and that all comes from social pressure because of Hylergian culture that dictates that you have to be in this armor. And the fact that he shoots all of these little critters with his arm cannon when he's talking with Elio, that seems to be indicative of a need to show strength because he's scared he isn't strong, isn't able, we could even say. But he is able. In fact, he is his most able when he takes off his carapace and helps his son by swaddling him. So he was never truly disabled at all, per the social model. Social pressures only made him think of himself as such. And now we can talk about Olga. Like Grigon, she struggles to be a parent. And at first, she comes across as unsupportive because she has concerns about Elio and his obsession with aliens and how it makes him antisocial, and she wants him to have friends and to thrive, etc. But she eventually learns that if she supports Elio, as in supports who he is, then that is what will help him thrive, and that is what will help him make friends. If she just lets others know that Elio is who Elio is, and even though he's different, that doesn't mean he is bad or unworthy of your friendship, then Elio will be okay. But it takes her a while to get there. But I think when she realizes that the clone Elio isn't the real Elio, she understands what makes Elio special, and she wants the old Elio back. But at the same time, the way she treats Elio initially, even though it's out of concern for his well-being, that does create a rift between the two of them, with Elio even screaming that Olga is not his family. And he even goes on to repeat her frustrations at trying to parent Elio to Grigon, talking about how none of us wanted this anyway. And he talks about how he was shipped off because he was too hard to deal with. And Grigon takes offense at that. So the divide between Olga and Elio creates more conflict, which shows that it is bad, and Olga just needs to accept Elio for who he is. And that brings me to Glorden, whose father needs to accept him for who he is, because he doesn't want to get into his carapace, and he doesn't want to be a war machine, he says. And he does have a disability because he is prone to hypothermia, and like I said, he needs that disc to regulate his temperature. He does seem to have a super ability. He's fireproof, and he protects Elio from the lava, which strengthens their bond. But yeah, he is disabled, and there's nothing wrong with that. And he doesn't need this armor. He just needs to be himself, and he will be fine if he is supported by his father. And we will be fine if we are supported by everyone. The film talks about how we are not alone with that Carl Sagan voiceover. We are not alone in the universe, and people who have disabilities are not alone, even though it seems that way sometimes. The solution to the problem of ableism, the movie says, is a supportive community. And we see that in the climax, which I've talked about, where they depend on the people on Earth, Olga and Elio, to navigate them through the debris field to help bring Glorden home. And some of those people include Bryce, who formerly bullied Elio, and Melmac, who Olga shunned for being eccentric or what have you, or even neurodivergent himself, maybe. So yeah, we need a strong community in order to thrive, the movie says, and we need to accept other people for their differences. And that leads me to my final thoughts. I thought Elio was swellio. I don't think it definitely does not smellio. But it is unfortunate that it doesn't identify Elio as neurodivergent, even though he very much seems to be. Why they didn't go the extra step and call him autistic or neurodivergent in the film is beyond me. I hope it's not because they didn't want to alienate people, because it is important that we don't pathologize or stigmatize neurodivergence, especially with the whole Tylenol RFK thing. Alright, thank you guys, I'll see you next time.
Please comment the answers to or email me the answers to the following questions. 1. Grigan being disabled without his armor because tradition says so is an example of what model of disability? 2. What is something about Elio that suggests he represents a neurodivergent person? 3. What does the film present as the solution to the problem of ableism?